Hi everyone, welcome. You might be asking, what is all this with these upside down stickers? You know what all this is? This is just a clear example of me procrastinating. For me, usually these upside down stickers means there's nothing going on here, nothing to see. These are really just completed bins in which I'm just doing nothing more than storing castings. And that's the one classification I really don't like to see in my tracking spreadsheet, is bins that are just idle doing this. So at some point I'll move them into storage, but, then I wouldn't be the procrastinator that I am. Technically, the position that they're occupying now should be held by my oldest systems, which is, at this point, the European nightcrawlers and the yellow buckets. I finally felt like today I've got to move them, elevate them at least to the top shelf, even if they can't occupy the position that's rightfully theirs, the top left position on the shelf as the oldest systems. At least get them on the top shelf, and they look good there. For 250 days old, that's pretty old in my wormery, I've been pushing it. I've been pushing the envelope on how old I want to let systems get in my wormery. Somehow 150, 180 days used to be a big deal, and the fact that these are 250 is sort of new to me, I guess. I mean, I've run other systems for a long time, like my VERMIBAG Mini. That thing ran 700 days, but that's a much larger system. These are actually pretty small, and then when you see how filled they are, which is maybe a third of the way filled, not even maybe, there's not a whole lot in there. But they're due for their feeding because, go ahead, say it, you know why. It's been 14 days. Another 14-day interval has passed, and that's always the interval for feeding these things. So I'm going to get them up on the bench, slip on a glove, and they're going to get fed. For quite some time, these systems all had these nice tailored coverings, one for each. You can even see some evidence why we stopped using them a couple feedings ago. We noticed how things were getting very damp and even soaking up into the coverings. Is at that time we decided, let's not cover and just let a little bit of the moisture content in these systems evaporate. And these papers that are still covering up, these coffee filters just show us where we last fed. And the reason we show, because we alternate. So today's feeding, we'll go in on that side, but before we excavate the hole to put today's feeding in, why don't we take a quick peek at how things from the last feeding are holding up. There's not going to be much to see because the last couple feedings have consisted of nothing more than coffee and worm chow. I think one of our main goals for the most recent couple check-ins has been to see if we can help some of the more damp material out to the surface, help it up to a spot where it can air out a little bit and maybe dry off a little, lose some of its moisture content. Because while the worms really love it, I'm sure, to me, it just feels like it might be on the brink of being too damp. With the dry feedings, with only the coffee and worm chow going in, with the lack of coverings over the past month or so, since we removed the coverings, I've seen so little difference in the moisture content. Maybe a little bit of a drop. Yeah, I think even last time, when I reviewed the video from our last check-in 14 days ago, I do remember at least acknowledging the fact that we did see a little bit of an improvement, a little bit of drop in the moisture content of the material. And I wouldn't want to deny that. I wouldn't want to deny that that fact being present again. I do believe what might have been a little bit overly damp in the past is now getting a lot better. My measure for that is just how crumbly and flowing the material is. So the side that we fed on last time obviously is not going to show leftovers if all we fed was coffee and worm chow, and if it was 2 weeks ago, you would expect nothing. The one thing we will see, though, going now 2 feedings back, 28 days ago, was a feeding that obviously won't have any leftovers either, since it was also coffee and worm chow, but it was fed with bedding. So we threw in cardboard, it seems. This might have actually been like an old top covering piece of newspaper that got recycled to be bedding / food. The thinking was that we're not going to feed with bedding during the last check-in, because we did find a good amount of it remaining in here still. And it almost seems there's just I don't know. Is it just my imagination, or do we have just as many worms hanging out in the material where the bedding is versus where the most recent feeding is, or was? Was is, I think, the important word here. You know, every time I review the videos for this bin, I keep remembering that I have this weird strand of something, which I know is not going to break down ever, because it never changes, so it's coming out. I'm glad I bumped into it. I kind of knew I would, but this time I'm actually removing it because that was my plan, because it's just something that's not really going to get broken down. So there's still a little bit of material in this, believe it or not. I didn't think I'd see much, but I thought I would at least see a little bit. Little bits of leftover bedding, little scraps of shredded paper here and there. Some of it is not my shredded paper prepared bedding either. Some of it was like a larger bit of paper here and there. So I treat that as like the balance in the diet, you know. If all I'm feeding is like a nitrogen-rich sort of food item or food items, and those food items are, number one is the worm chow. Let's get that in here first. And then the other food item is the coffee. Let's get that in here too. If I treat those as sort of the nitrogen-rich food for this feeding, the question is, well, what if they need something more like a carbon-rich type food? Well, my hope is that there's sufficient leftovers remaining still from that feeding 2 feedings ago that did include shredded paper, because at this point I'm thinking that's pretty much all they're going to get. I mean, I kicked around the idea of maybe retiring the feeding zone indicator to just say, well, maybe this will be the last feeding. This will be feeding number 19. And yeah, maybe we'll, you know, indicate where we fed, but maybe in such a way that the feeding zone indicator is primarily submerged, so that the worms need some sort of additional carbon-based or more carbon-heavy type food item. Then they can nibble on that if they really get desperate. It's not just sitting out on the surface dry, useless to them. So why don't we do that? I'm going to just sort of slightly reopen the feeding side, but rather than having it rest out on top, we're just going to have the majority of it under the surface, a little bit of it sticking out, just so we could still see where it is. I guess if we really needed to, we can submerge the whole thing and then just go digging for it. But I'm also kind of thinking, well, what if they really went crazy on that thing and just decided to eat the whole thing? Maybe at least having one little piece of it protruding that remains dry so that they can't eat it. Well, not that they can't eat it, but they'll be less likely to eat it. Maybe that'll help us a little bit. Some sort of a weird, tough thing that I can't seem to break up. Oh, there it goes. And I don't know. For now, I'm starting to think, I don't know. I was going to put the cardboard coverings back on, but right now I'm thinking we're just going to stick to what we've been doing for the past few check-ins, which is leaving it uncovered, let it further dry, you know, and that'll just reduce traffic on the surface. So anything like this on the surface that still needs further work won't really get the attention it needs. But I think that's the sacrifice we're going to have to make just to allow the entire rest of the material get to a slightly drier level, which is kind of where I'd like it to be soon. So let's leave it at that. Let's leave that as the template for treating the remaining 2 systems, and then it'll be on to bucket number 2. Alright, we'll follow suit with what we did in bin 1 here in bin 2, and likewise in bin 3, and that all assumes we encounter similar situations. If we need to deviate to, you know, account for something going on, then we can and will. So over on the side where we most recently fed, where there'd been no bedding applied with that feeding, it's pretty much castings only, and a fair bit of worms hanging out in the material. Definitely not as moist as the first bin. Well, I mean, that doesn't mean a lot different, but just somehow clearly not as moist. More of it seems to break apart much more readily into a much finer consistency, where I see very little clumping at all. That somehow, to me, seems like the right consistency. Lots of worms in here. Alright. Very fun. All right, get off the wall there, buddy. So, you know, like we did before, we're gonna go to the opposite side where 2 feedings ago there'd been, you know, bedding applied, of which there seems to be leftovers still. I think even in the last check-in we noticed how this system seemed to have a little bit more leftover, suggesting that maybe it's a little bit slower. I don't know. Hard to say. Again, I'm not going to try to look for ways that the systems differ from one another. I'd like to keep thinking that they're almost identical within reason. And here I just don't really feel that need to bring up overly damp stuff. I mean, everything feels really nice. At best, I feel like maybe I'll take a clumped up piece of bedding or paper and try to twirl it around until it breaks apart into something looser rather than a little dumpling, or a little dumpling, is that the right word? I've been using the word dumpling down here in my wormery a little bit too much. Maybe I'm getting some sort of a craving for some sort of food. Because I don't know if dumpling is the right word. Little, you know, little meatball. Meatball? Little bread ball. Matzo ball? I don't know. I'm trying to portion the coffee out in a way that I leave an equal amount for the final system. Perhaps we can just add a little bit more of this worm chow, and that to me seems like a fairly similar sized feeding to what they got in the other bin. So let's leave it at that. And oh, let's not forget, we're going to be feeding zone indicator. It's going to be deployed a little differently here, same as the last system, which was to allow most of it to be below the surface and accessible as a supplement to the feeding, versus just sitting out on the surface as decoration in a way. Leave a little bit of it protruding so we can really easily see exactly where it's at, so we can come right back to it. And we're good to go on to bucket number 3. Okay, same story here. Not a lot of deviation at this point, hopefully. But let's check to make sure. I'm never sure if it's because of the fact that food had been most recently applied to that side, or if it was just because of the cover being there, that little piece of paper on top, providing them a little place to go rather than come out here, because it does seem like there is some fresh castings deposited out here on the top surface over where it was last fed. And you don't really see that out here, so I don't know if it's because it was slightly covered with the feeding zone indicator, or if it was just because of the fact that it was fed there. Moisture, how do I rate the moisture? Not notably different. Perhaps you are visually already seeing that it is tending to be a little bit more clumpy, a little bit more similar to what we saw in bucket number 1 versus what we saw in bucket number 2. Still thinking bucket number 2 is the drier of the 3, and this one is very similar to bucket number 1. Virtually identical in texture and moisture content, or at least that's how it feels to me. Obviously no leftovers on this side either. There's been no bedding placed on this side for some time now. We're probably just going to see some leftover bedding from 2 feedings ago over where we're going to be putting today's feeding. Hopefully there's enough of it remaining here too that's going to satisfy their needs going forward. And as a just-in-case sort of parachute, the feeding zone indicator will be set up in a way that they can nibble on it if they have to. Let's see. I thought I saw something. Oh. Maybe they're going to be a little bit more dependent on that coffee filter than I was expecting. Here's like the fairly beaten up stem of a banana peel, pretty weathered. This to me seems like maybe a little chunk of paper that only survived because it was resting on the surface. I could feel how dry it is. I'm just going to break it apart and make it more accessible. Once it's buried, it'll soak up neighboring moisture. It feels like it would be nice to see a little bit more shreds of paper in here as leftovers. But I guess if they need some, there's probably enough of it in here still. If they need it, they can find it. I'm not going to panic. I'm going to assume that we're still in good shape as we Saw on the other two systems here too. Everything's really good. Material's really nice. I think at this point we should be able to just dump in what remains, and that was kind of how I imagined a fair distribution of it, although somehow it seems like this system got more coffee. That's fine. Oh, what's this? Some sort of a large... It's probably the shell of a mango, maybe. I think we ran into the same exact piece in another previous check-in. Here's another piece of very similar mango shell, I believe. Very, very weathered. All right. So, I'm just curious to see what people think. Is it time to start covering this thing back up with the cardboard covering? Oh, look at all that. Little bonus stash of dry paper. Just what they wanted. Just what the doctor ordered for this bin. We're going to blend that in nicely, too. Make sure they've got access to all that stuff as carbon food source. Keep balance here. That was kind of good. I'm glad I did crumble it up, too, because if it just remained in like a clump like that, it wouldn't have gone very far. Although it might have helped just to have been submerged. If it just sat out on the surface, it would have gone nowhere. So, all right. Once again, we're going to create a little pit into which our feeding zone indicator can be, for the most part, submerged. A little bit poking out still, so we can zero in on its location quickly and easily next time. And that completes feeding number 19 for our 3 250-day-old European nightcrawler worm buckets, which I'm questioning if they're going to even get a feeding number 20 at this point. For now, I'm just going to mark this as a feeding, not classifying this as foraging yet, but at some point in the near future we might, and we might even shed the whole 14-day interval thing at some point, maybe 10 days from now, who knows, a week from now, maybe I'll decide, you know what, let's really decide that they're foraging, and if we need to do something special to help move that along, or whatever the case may be, maybe we'll come back in here in another 7 to 10 days just to deliberately break the 14-day pattern. How does that sound? All right, everyone, that's it for today's check-in with the yellow buckets. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated, too. All right, everyone, thanks again for watching. Bye-bye. Have a great day.